Welcome back. So polls have officially closed in Namibia's presidential and parliamentary elections. The country's Electoral Commission is expected to announce the results once vote counting is complete. The poll is said to be the most competitive election yet. This is for the ruling Swapo party, which has governed the Southern African nation for 34 years. Now, if Swapo wins, its leader, Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, will become the country's first female president. Swapo loss, however, would mean the first transition of power to a new party since Namibia gained independence from apartheid South Africa in 1990. About 1.4 million people are registered to vote.
Voters waited in long lines outside polling stations in Namibia's capital, Windhoek, on Wednesday morning. It's an election that could mark a historic shift in the country's political landscape if the ruling Swapo party loses the presidency or control of parliament for the first time. Swapo has governed the Southern African nation since leading it to independence from apartheid South Africa in 1990. Its presidential candidate is Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, the current vice president.
Voting is not just your constitutional responsibility, but it is also your national responsibility.
Nandi-Ndaitwah would be the country's first female leader if she wins. She faces 14 opposition candidates in Namibia's most competitive election in decades. Presidential candidates need more than 50% of the ballot to win, or there will be a runoff. Swapo saw support fall to 56% in the 2019 presidential election from 87% in 2014. Political analysts say there's a chance Swapo could be ousted by young people fed up with high unemployment, inequality and corruption allegations. Although long-standing loyalty to the party among older and rural voters could help pull it through. Namibia has seen relatively strong economic growth in recent years, driven by investments in oil, gas and green hydrogen. But it ranks second highest in the world for income inequality, according to World Bank figures. About 1.4 million people are registered to vote in the sparsely populated country of around 3 million, according to the Electoral Commission. Results are expected within a few days.
Right, and the clock is ticking, of course, for those results to come in. But for more on the elections, we are joined by Institute for Public Policy Research Executive Director Graham Hopwood, who is joining us from Windhoek. Graham, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think let's start with describing the mood, right, on voting day in Namibia.
Well, it's been a day marked by long queues, delays, and rising frustration amongst the voters here. So, although the polls were supposed to close at 9 o'clock this evening, many thousands of people across the country are still in line waiting to vote. We do have an electoral rule that if people are in line at 9 o'clock, they are still allowed to vote. So it does look like at many polling stations, especially in Windhoek and at the coast, the more populous urban areas, that voters will be still voting into the early hours of the morning. And that's definitely going to delay the whole announcing of results by possibly a day or so. So I think voters have become quite frustrated. The Electoral Commission has run into a lot of problems, lack of ballot papers in some areas, unexpected high turnouts, some problems with machine failures, equipment failures in the polling stations. So all this has combined to lead to thousands of people who still have to register their votes. And some are fearing they may be denied their rights, but hopefully if they can stay in line through the night, then they will still get to vote.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and perhaps, you know, it's a moment for us to reflect on, I suppose, how different Namibia and South Africa are, because I think of 1.4 million voters, and one would think that that's a very small amount, and yet even as we get closer to 9:45, not everyone having cast their vote. How many polls, voting stations were there? I mean, was that an issue of there simply not being sufficient voting stations?
Well, there were over 4,000 polling stations countrywide, of which quite a number are mobile polling stations, so they move from place to place. Of course, Namibia is a huge country with many remote communities, so that's why we try to use remote mobile polling stations to reach everybody. But there seem to be I think failures on the part of the Electoral Commission in terms of the training of their staff. They only finished training polling officials last week. So I think a lot of these people are not perhaps experienced enough to handle the process smoothly. So a number of factors have just combined together to lead to some really frustrating delays.
Yeah. So what's your sense of how things could possibly go in the days that come? And I know that it's going to be difficult for you to sort of throw the bones and say, well, this is what we're expecting things to look like, where the results are certainly where the results are concerned. But you've seen some of the people standing in the queues. What's the general sense that you get from people around, whether or not they're leaning, towards holding on to Swapo, the liberation movement, if you will, of Namibia, or if 34 years on, you do have a generation of Namibians that says, no, we need new leaders?
So definitely there's a generational gap here. One hears from a lot of younger voters, particularly in urban areas, in Windhoek in particular, that they are totally fed up with the current situation and want to see the ruling Swapo party out of government. But whether young people in rural areas and whether older people in rural areas believe that is not so clear. We don't really have opinion polling here, so difficult to predict. But the feeling is that the Swapo will lose a lot of support in Windhoek and other urban areas, but they might hold on to a 50% plus for themselves in the National Assembly, and probably 50% plus for the presidential candidate. If the rural north, where we have a lot of people, maybe 60% of the population living up near the Angolan border, although it's rural, it's still a very populous area. So if they come through for the ruling party, then I think they're likely to hold on. But in terms of the results, well, we do the counting and announcing at polling station level, which is supposed to be a certain level of transparency. So we might see some polling station results being posted on social media from the early hours of this morning, but it's quite likely that the Electoral Commission won't confirm the constituency level results until quite a bit later tomorrow, and then we expect those results to keep rolling through Friday and Saturday, and hopefully we get to a final result on Saturday, although the delays that we're experiencing now have put that in doubt.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful for us then. And then there's, I want to look at some of the front runners. Obviously, a lot of eyes on whether or not, Swapo is going to put forward that first female president. But in the opposition, front runners that stand out?
So the main challenger to Swapo and their candidate is Dr. Panduleni Itula. He's a dentist, lived in the UK for many years, came back to Namibia in 2013. Stood as an independent candidate and sort of shook up the vote in 2019, and then launched his own party, the Independent Patriots for Change, in 2020. So they are seen as the main challengers to Swapo, and they're likely to be the official opposition. Some of the pundits here think that he might do well enough in the presidential vote to force a second round, which would mean within 60 days we'd have to have a runoff between the top two, likely to be Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah of Swapo and then Itula of IPC. That still seems a bit of a long shot, although it's not impossible. And we'll have to see how the results shape up tomorrow, if that could be a possibility. But yeah, he's the main guy, and the IPC, but we do have other contenders. It's likely that the Popular Democratic Movement, which is led by Makeni Vanani, the current official opposition, will lose votes to the IPC and will lose their status as the official opposition. And then we have a more radical party in the mold more of the economic freedom fighters called Affirmative Repositioning, which did well in our provisional voting. We had some early voting on November the 13th, came in third then. So if they continue like that in this main vote, then they could emerge as maybe the third most powerful, strongest party in our National Assembly. So yeah, quite a bit of competition. We have a very generous proportional representation system, so there'll be seats for a lot of smaller parties as well, who maybe only gain 1,000 or maybe a few thousand votes nationally, but it's enough for them to get maybe 1 or 2 seats.
Okay, really interesting. I think a final question before I let you go, Graham, is I suppose the campaigning sort of issues that really were important for candidates to speak to as they spoke to the electorate, some of the biggest issues that people in Namibia really want to be solved in the new administration?
So you have unemployment as the dominating issue, particularly youth unemployment. Huge frustration amongst the youth that they can't find jobs. Even, well-qualified graduates have been struggling for years to find jobs. Probable youth unemployment rate of around 50%. So when you get that combined with other failures in service delivery and also increasing reports of corruption, then obviously that does cause a big credibility problem for the ruling party. So those have been the main issues that have been discussed most on the campaign trail. And that's the ones that are going to probably lead to Swapo suffering a loss of support. We just don't know how much support they will lose.
Yeah, we're going to leave it there. Graham, thank you so much for speaking to us. An absolute pleasure. Graham Hopwood there speaking to us. And of course, he's with the Institute for Public Policy as Public Policy Research as their Executive Director. All right, you're still watching Newsfeed PM. Let's move on to other news now. So fresh anti-government protests have erupted in Mozambique's capital, Maputo. Today, protesters and police clashed with rubber bullets and tear gas was fired. The demonstrations are over last month's disputed elections. Opposition leader Venancio Mondlane has rejected the results in which incumbent Daniel Chapo of the Frelimo party allegedly won. Human rights groups say at least 30 people have been killed since police crackdowns on the protests. Civil society groups and Western observers have said the election was unfair and that results were altered. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan has pledged to ensure transparency and fairness in the country's local elections. Millions of Tanzanians took to the polls today despite the disqualification of several candidates. This election is seen as a crucial test for Hassan's administration ahead of the presidential polls in October 2025. Hassan, who assumed office in 2021 following the sudden death of her predecessor, John Magufuli, initially earned praise for easing restrictions on opposition and media freedoms. However, critics argue she has backtracked on reforms using tactics reminiscent of Magufuli's authoritarian approach. Rights groups in Western governments have expressed concern about escalating repression, including arrests of opposition politicians.